What's up? My name is Mwalimu Tarik. I'm a PhD student at Temple University's Department of Africology, African American Studies. I'm a student of Dr. Malefi Kete Sante, Dr. Alan Mazama, and Dr. Kimani Nahusi. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all some insight I have and research I've done concerning the field of African studies, Africology, Black studies. And this is something that many people have an interest in and might be confused with the terminology or understanding what is it that Black studies or Africology is doing and why is it not African studies and what is the difference. And when we look at education, there are major aspects, and three of the major aspects I want to point out is curriculum, pedagogy, and paradigm. And curriculum primarily concerns itself with what is it that you teach? What is the curriculum? Pedagogy is how do you teach? And paradigm, which is mainly what we're going to be looking at today, is from where do you teach? What is the cultural location that you're grounding your research in your educational pursuits? And I just wanted to put this out here before we really get started, because when we look at all these things and people are talking about Black education and Afrocentric education, or sometimes they'll use the terminology, which is really the same, African centered education, the conversation gets confused oftentimes with this idea of self respect or self esteem. And this is a quote by Asante that I just want to lay out there before we get started. So Asante says, since the 1960s, cultural sensitivity has been confused with the movement to establish Black studies and the study of Africa as an academic pursuit. Black studies programs rarely were privileged with department status spread all over the country, but many traditionalists simply regarded them as places where Black students could build self-esteem and study the achievements of Black writers. The conceptual underpinnings of the movement, the idea it grew from a unique perspective as well as a coherent culture, were denied. So what we're talking about isn't just let's teach about Africa and let's teach about our culture to make us feel good. We're looking at quality education, education with a purpose. And really, when we're talking about African studies and we're looking at Black studies and Africology, there's an underlying understanding that we're also talking about the legitimacy of the study of Africa. Who has the ability to produce the next generation of scholars who are going to produce the next generation after that and subsequent generations? Who is going to set the standard for education? And when we look at this, oftentimes, we get invested with the academy, but the academy is one of the major battlegrounds. And we're looking at who is producing PhDs, who's producing the next generation of educational leaders. And then when we understand that, we have to look at who are the gatekeepers, who are blocking people who might be the potential leaders. And then also, we have this debate that comes along with it, who and what are considered to be Africa. And you see there's implications for this battle that's happening in the highest ranks of the academy that ripple down all the way to different levels of education, going down to primary school to secondary school. And so African studies and the African Studies Association were they're one of the entities that dominate this field of the study of Africa, and they were established in 1957. And they call themselves, this is from their website, the flagship membership organization devoted to enhancing the exchange of information about Africa. And you see, if you look at this language, the African Studies Association and African Studies in general, they address issues of curriculum and they address issues of pedagogy oftentimes. But what they often don't address is the issue of paradigm. And a lot of it has to do from what is their intellectual grounding. And part of that has to do with the history of African studies, and I'll get into it. But when you look at African studies, it's most oftentimes an interdisciplinary pursuit when you're looking at this history and the phenomena of Africa. And one of the great foundations of African studies is anthropology. And so anthropology, this is from Foucault, who's a French philosopher. It says anthropology itself is possibly only on the basis of certain situation of absolute singular event. Anthropology has its roots in fact and possibility that property belongs to the history of our culture. Anthropology can assume its proper dimensions only within a historical sovereignty, always restrained but always present of European thought, and the relation that it brings face to face with all other cultures as well as itself. So what he's basically saying here is that anthropology is grounded, just like many things, within the European ethos, or we could say the Eurocentric paradigm. And that's one thing that I always conceptualize. What is the difference between anthropology and sociology? And what it is anthropology oftentimes is the study of non-European or non-European influenced cultures from a Eurocentric paradigm, where a sociological study is more often not, oftentimes a Eurocentric study of a society, but it's from themselves. So it's sociology is white folks studying themselves, and anthropology is white folks studying non-white folks. And so the African Studies Association, when you look at how it's grounded on these ideas which work to dismember Africa, right? They break up the history of Africa to the pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, and you see those that frame of reference doesn't really make sense from an Afrocentric point of view, because the pre-colonial history of Africa, it dwarfs anything that follows afterwards in terms of length of time and social phenomena, and what we can take out of that time period. And so all of these time periods are broken up about, this is before white people came, this is while white people had direct influence, and this is after white folks have physically left the continent in most places. And they also have the physical dismemberment of Africa, where they cut off North Africa from the rest of the continent. And so they say there's sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, ancient Africa, and the African diaspora, right? And then oftentimes they don't even talk about the African diaspora that lives in the East. And so what you have is these things are studied, but they're often not studied together. And a major issue that comes out of the African Studies Association and the way that they understand history and understand the way that African phenomena should be studied, they have this view that their study should be apolitical, right, or objective. And what does, it really makes them sympathetic to Eurasian imperialism and the idea of globalization. And this is a quote you guys can check out. But this idea of objectivity is one that's oftentimes being interrogated, especially in current discourse. And one of the major points, one of my colleagues, Zach Brooks, brought up, he says objectivity alienates you from your own culture and alienates you from your own ancestors. And that's something that we need to be aware of. And the African Studies Association has a long history of people within the organization fighting to assert, African-centered, Afrocentric paradigms of study, pedagogy, and a more Afrocentric curriculum. So they're trying to address all three of those points. And really, the first time that we see this major ripple in the African Studies Association happens in 1969, when John Henrik Clark and the Black Caucus, they voice their concerns and their demands. They say, we see that you're dividing up history in such a way. We see that you're dismembering Africa and different African peoples. And this is an incomplete way to study the history of Africa. And eventually, their issues were never addressed, and the Black Caucus left. And they created their own organization, the African Heritage Studies Association. But till this day, you see this issue about how does Africa fit into African studies. It continues to arise over and over again. And the principal issue is the idea of agency. Where is the agency in African studies? Where is the African in African studies? There's actually a work called that. And when you look at African studies, more often than not, you have interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary programs. But many of them, what that implies is that you need a white ideological chaperone. I got that from a text I was reading the other day, which was talking about, films, and how when when you're doing anything, you can't just stand on your own. You need to have this white ideological chaperone, and more often than not, we see that as um, people embracing the Eurocentric paradigm within their study. And so the interdisciplinarity of African studies really becomes a vehicle in which Eurasia becomes, the foundation to your study, even though you're trying to study African people. And what you do is you inherit the assumptions and the canons of other disciplines, such as history, philosophy, anthropology, and you inherit the assumptions of their founders. Hegel, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, Engels, Voltaire, and the Greco-Roman philosophers. And so it makes it very hard for you to break away from that. And ultimately, it doesn't really leave you much room to challenge the paradigmatic hegemony over the academy and over the study of Africa. And it also doesn't demand the respect of a discipline. And so what that means is that you can be basically relegated into a program or a specialization within one of these other departments or other disciplinary pursuits, where you're not the study of Africa, the study of African Americans, the study of African people pan or transcontinentally isn't worth studying on its own, and it needs to have this chaperone, like I've been saying. And so these are a few issues with the Eurocentric approach. These are things I've talked about before, so I'll be skipping this. And I just want to make a quick note that we need to be clear that to be an African person and to teach about Africa doesn't necessarily make you Afrocentric. Because Africanity, which is meaning like Africanness, that is more of a term to describe identity. And Afrocentricity is about cognitive location. So you can be a black person and still be deeply embedded within the Eurocentric ethos. So Africology, which many of you may know, is the Afrocentric study of African phenomena and knowledge. And it's a disciplinary approach to African narratives, culture, values, and the possibilities of African people transnationally, transcontinentally, and transgenerationally, meaning black people everywhere throughout time. And so one of the reasons why Temple University became uh, the first PhD program to be able to have a Black Studies program uh, with a PhD requirement is because of their understanding of discipline, saying we need to be grounded within our own paradigm, and we need to be able to stand on our own. Uh, and being able to stand on your own allows you to have the sovereignty that we're looking for. And so again, I want to reiterate that the value of the Afrocentric paradigm in the study of Africa is not about the restoration of self-esteem, making black people feel good, even though that is a very positive outcome. But what we're really looking at is the restoration of truth, the restoration of African agency. We're looking to correct cultural dislocation and miseducation, and also the celebration of intellectual diversity. All these universities, they use this terminology diversity, but when you have every single discipline grounded within the same cultural and paradigm and same cultural ethos, it's not really a diversity of ideas. It's just different expressions of the same cultural idea, and different colors of people saying the same cultural ideas. But when you have, a plurality of centricities, then you're able to actually have this idea that we're able to exchange knowledge from our own cultural base. And so when you look at, the Afrocentric method, there's 5 general qualities. But I'm going to break it down here with the minimum characteristics of an Afrocentric project. So when we do our research and we're trying to ground our research within the Afrocentric paradigm, we need to be aware of 5 things. We need to have an interest in psychological location, right? Cultural cognitive location. we need to have a commitment to finding the African subject place, finding where do African people fit into this history or this phenomena. We need to have an understanding that many of our African cultural elements have been under attack for centuries. And we need to be able to defend why these things exist within their cultural context. And we also need, this is very important to me, we have to have a commitment to lexical refinement, or a commitment to changing the terminologies and the language that we use to reflect the humanity and the Africanity of our ancestors. So the biggest and easiest example for me is it's a disgrace when we call our ancestors slaves, because a slave is a non-human. A slave, it sounds like that's the totality of their identity. But our ancestors were Africans who were enslaved, or they were Africans who did X, Y, and Z. But they were, they were African people. They weren't slaves, because where does a slave come from? A slave, that could be anyone. That could come from Slovakia. And then also, and finally, we need to have a commitment to correct the dislocations and the miseducations of the history of Africa. And this is an example of lexical refinement. We need to understand the power of language and the power that words have. We need to look at the significance of wording. And when we look at it, there's really two ways it can go. You can have a pathological understanding, or you can have an understanding of a word that restores the agency and the humanity of our ancestors in our community. And so the easy example is looking at like slave as a pathological understanding and enslaved as a way to restore humanity. So that's what I have for you guys today. I'm very excited to talk with you guys during the Q&A. I have a lot more to say, but 15 minutes is not a lot of time. But I'm very eager to start the conversation with you all, and I'll see you all during the lecture. Peace.